You see, the darkness, it only came because we let the fathers, the monsters, we let them rule. But now, all we have to do is make a breadsheet.
Cliff Barton. That's at Cliff Barton 4. That's at CLIFFBARTON 4, numeral 4. No spaces, no underscores. On Twitter, not to be confused with Clint Barton. I believe that's Hawkeye from the Avengers names. Cliff, I love you, man. He's a great follow. Prolific tweeter, fellow Steve Martin fanatic. Steve Martin is one of my all-time heroes. In case you didn't know, The Jerk. That's my favorite movie of all time. And he's a great, funny writer, Mr. Cliff Barton. Very prolific on the tweeters. I think I already said that. One of his favorite pastimes seems to be poking at sensitive white people, and that can be very fun to watch unfold. It's entertaining to me. I never met Cliff in person or even seen his face, but I can tell he's a wonderful person with a soul full of love and compassion, so go ahead and follow him at Cliff Barton 4. Cliff, consider yourself called the frick out. Maybe we should put a sound effect. My name is Hoss Bossman, and this is Breadsheet. Today, we have the rest of the interview with Ben Burgis. This is going to be a short intro, I promise. It's going to be less than
15 minutes.
Speaking of wonderful people with souls full of love, however, I must unfortunately shout out two people. I've got two RIPs to share this week, sadly. First, quickly, the great anarchist, anthropologist, and author David Graeber passed away a few days ago. I've only read one of his books, Bullshit Jobs. I only recently kind of learned about him, and that's a bummer that he passed away so shortly after I learned of his work. But that book is a fantastic illustration of how absurd our economic system and modern lifestyles are. Basically about the idea that as production and efficiency have increased, we've continued to work ourselves to death, creating a wide variety of jobs that are not only unpleasant and unfulfilling, but also completely pointless. Capitalism sucks, and a lot of his work seems to be about that. And I'm looking forward to reading the rest of his work, but I'm not so happy about what's motivated me to do so. Rest in peace, rest in power, David Graeber. Now, the second rest in power is a personal one. I wasn't sure if I should bring this up on the show, and I'm still not certain it's the best idea, but it feels wrong not to acknowledge it. And my friend Trent passed away. It's the oldest and closest friend I've ever lost. He was just an amazing person, and he had some music, some instrumental music and stuff that he made, and just other stuff that I'm going to play for you in a little bit. Just, a little send-off for a guy I knew for over 20 years, most of my life. He was just one of the kindest, most imaginative, creative, intelligent, warm, effervescent people I've ever had the privilege of knowing. I had known him since I first moved to Georgia around age 9 or 10. So yeah, over 20 years. This is still pretty fresh, and I'm going to be processing it for a while. But for now, I'll just say that Trent was one of the most in-the-moment people I've ever known, and life is just not going to be the same without him. I just spoke to him like a week or two ago for the first time in quite a while, and I'm glad that I at least got to do that. You can look on my social media for some videos and pictures and exchanges and stuff that I've posted of him on my Twitter and whatnot. One of the ways I'm coping with this is encouraging people to donate to Nucci Space, which is a suicide prevention mental health charity geared toward musicians. They're a practice space with gear that musicians paid to use, and we used to use it all the time back when we were, some of us living in Athens and whatnot. And we've done some benefit shows for them and stuff, and they're just great folks over there. Those proceeds go to various suicide prevention efforts. They do things like offer free counseling sessions with licensed mental health professionals. They even do stuff like My old music editor at Flagpole Magazine, I think, volunteers there sometimes. She's an entertainment lawyer now. But anyway, Nucci Space, if you would, just go donate to them. And actually, I forgot to get the web address. Let me pull that up real quick. Okay, it's just nucci.org, and that's spelled NUCI.org. So just go give to them. I think probably I might get with some people and do like a GoFundMe to, actually have like a fundraising goal to contribute to Nucci Space or some other kind of similar charity. So, but for now, just go drop them $1, $5, whatever. They have Nucci Space masks, which, everybody does now, but, you can buy those. And yeah, so Nucci Space. Anywho, if I sound a little less excited this time around during this intro, you have some idea why now. I'm going to talk more about Trent. He really did have like a huge impact on my life. I would be a completely different person right now if it weren't for knowing him. I met him like very formative time in my life. He's one of the first close friends I had when I first moved to Georgia. There were times when I was younger that I definitely would have like called him my best friend. But we have a very closely knit friend group, and everybody loved him. Everybody who met him loved him. He was just this ball of kinetic energy and love, just a wonderful person. Anyway, yeah, I'm going to talk more about him, try and figure out other ways I can honor his memory, get my feelings out about this horrible, horrible tragedy that has beset my very tightly knit, intimate friend group. I love all you guys. But as I'm not going to say your names because I know I'll leave somebody out because Trent touched so many people's lives. But you all know who you are. I love you. But as I said, it's still pretty fresh, so I'll probably be cutting some stuff out of this that I'm recording right now and trying to approach it with clearer eyes in the coming days. But yeah, it's been tough. Let's do like a little palate cleanser, not to forget about Trent, but just to move on as I know he would want us to do. A big topic that my guest today, Ben Burgis, this is part 2 of his interview. You should go back and listen to part 1. It's episode 5, the last episode I dropped. Ben Burgis, ready for his close-up. A big topic he's focusing on at the moment happens to be one I've been thinking a lot about lately. In short, sort of giving a fuller picture of the left than what most normies and right-wingers seem to see in their mind's eye and Twitter feeds often. Mr. Burgis and I are in agreement that much of the discourse on the left is unproductive and a turnoff to outsiders. I share his concern that the cancel culture stuff is not like helping our cause. Side note, the title of this episode is clickbait. I mean, we do talk about Joe Rogan a little bit, mostly as a jumping off point for talking about bigger issues, but I figured an episode with his name in the title would get more clicks. Sorry, but gotta do what you gotta do. Oh, and I believe that political scientist / professor / writer / great thinker Adolf Reed originated that phrase about how the left has become more concerned with whether or not people are going to heaven than actually improving the material conditions of working people. I think that's a cute, funny phrase there. So I'm talking about cancel culture and whatnot, obviously, something I've never really been fond of because I believe in charity and redemption, but also I don't talk about it that much because I also hate the way that the right wing and people like Sam Harris and whatnot and Joe Rogan often talk about cancel culture. I think they have kind of a misunderstanding of the dynamics that are going on there and they kind of oversimplify it. So yeah, I believe in charity and redemption. I'm not a religious man, but I guess some of those impulses I picked up from Christ's teachings, all the stuff about being nice and generous and loving and charitable mostly, which are the parts that a lot of prominent Christians seem to ignore for some reason, but I might not be a leftist if I hadn't learned those values so early on. So Dad, Mom, the reason that I'm a radical leftist now, it's y'all's fault for exposing me to Christ's teachings. He was the most radical leftist there ever was. So although I do think I have an overactive empathy response disorder or something, that's neither here nor there. But hey, parents, if you're raising your kids in Christianity and probably a lot of other religions, but I, of course, can only speak to my own experience, just know that they might end up learning leftist values and becoming radicalized because those are the values that Jesus taught. I should interview a pastor or something and talk about that stuff on here. My dream guest is Cornel West, Brother Cornel. It's fun to say that. That might never happen, but he's a big famous man, but God, he is just an artist in his own right, just as an orator. We talk about him in this episode actually coming up. But maybe I can get that pastor from Ebenezer Baptist Church, Raphael Warnock, who's running for Senate. I think I brought him up in the last episode. He's good and progressive and a preacher at Martin Luther King's church, which, that would be amazing. Have him on. I'd love to help amplify his voice and, help him get elected. Hey, y'all out there, anybody listening know of any good activists or people running for office that I can have on the show? Election season is, we're kind of ramping up now, and kind of the final stretch of election season. So yeah, if you have any causes or just ballot initiatives or something that you want me to try and promote on the show, we're still pretty small here at Breadsheet, but still would like to help in any way that I can. But anyway, being nicer and more understanding and forgiving about certain things would not hurt the left. And in many ways, I think it would be helpful for getting new people on board and teaching them what we're really all about. It is, as gross as it feels to say, a strategic sort of public relations issue. But I also happen to believe in it, and I'm a proud leftist because I believe in the love, the compassion, the charity, the generosity, all that squishy stuff. Hey folks, Hoss from the future here to insert myself from my closet straight into your earballs. I am recording on my brand new Zoom recorder with 2 condensers, recording in stereo, which is awesome and I think sounds pretty good. I'm going to continue using my beloved Blue Encore to capture my voice's buttery bass tones, but this is going to be awesome for live streaming music, conversations, recording real life podcasts. I feel like you're right there in the room with us. And I just thought I'd test it out for this edition of Insertion Time. I am going to play a snippet of one of my dearly departed friend Trent's instrumental works here in just a second to lead into the interview, just a sort of demo that he sent me. I've been going through my correspondence with Trent and finding little videos he sent me and song/riff ideas that he sent, and he was just a fantastic, incredibly creative and talented guitar player, and I wanted to share some of that with all you sheetheads out there. Okay, so now back to the rest of the intro. I promise, it's almost over. Oh, and one more thing, I forgot to hit record until 20 seconds into this interview. I had just asked Mr. Ben Burgis about Kamala Harris. The news of her vice presidential pick for Biden had just been announced that day, so I just asked him for some thoughts on that, and you didn't really miss much. You'll be able to gather kind of what he said in the first 20-30 seconds just by what he's saying there. So anyway, bye. I love you. Okay, I am cutting myself off now. This second half of my chat with Ben Burgis is fantastic. Stick around for the whole thing and get some tips from a seasoned leftist brain genius who's read Marxist theory and whatnot and probably even understood much of it. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Hoss_Bossman. Check out my YouTube channel, Hoss Bossman. HOSSBOSSMAN. That's Twitter and Instagram at Hoss HOSS_BOSSMAN. Follow Ben Burgis at Ben Burgis, BENBURGIS on Twitter. His podcasts are Dead Pundit Society and Give Them an Argument. I highly recommend both. His currently out book is Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left. And of course, wherever you are, Trent, swirling in the infinite cosmos, vibrating the quantum fabric of space-time with your chaotic energy that I and everyone who met you loved so, so much. You brought so much light into so many people's lives. This one's for you, buddy, and we're gonna pour one out for you. I love you with all of my soul.
In horse race terms, it's probably as smart a pick as anyone he was likely to do. He's obviously not going to go in some totally different direction politically. That wouldn't be Biden. Kamala herself, obviously has a pretty vile record. Most obviously in terms of mass incarceration, and her role first as DA and then especially as Attorney General in California. when I guess she claimed that this was done without her knowledge, but people working for her were like literally arguing against like prisoner early release, on the grounds that like the loss of like the prison labor would be bad for revenue. It's just like there's just like evil stuff like that in the record as AG, and generally, right, like I said, I believe in that case she claims that she didn't know they were going to argue that in court, but much more generally, up until a year and a half ago, the fact that she was such a tough prosecutor was her primary selling point. That was her brand. And then now that the winds have shifted in terms of people's feelings about mass incarceration, she really downplays it. She says she's a reformer. And this is pretty typical Harris. Like she, in 2018, 19, there was like, there were maybe whole months where she was for Medicare for All. She was a co-sponsor to Bernie's Medicare for All bill. Of course, she'd never expressed any interest in it before then, but like she was obviously gearing up to run for president. And it seemed like the smart move. There were like several centrists who were considering presidential runs who co-sponsored it. But then once she actually started running, she pivoted pretty much right away because she realized that trying to be Bernie light wasn't going to get her anywhere. So, she should run in a more centrist lane, and started supporting, a public option plan, which is a nice way of saying a two-tiered healthcare system with one standard of care for poor people and one for the middle class. And in general, right, I mean, she's like just a pretty mediocre kind of machine Democrat. So she's perfect for Biden. That's about what you'd expect.
Yeah, agreed on all that. I mean, she there's always something a little bit about her that I kind of like, just demeanor wise. Sure. And seeing her, I think it was in the Kavanaugh hearings, she was like, going on the attack, and that element, the prosecutor thing, obviously, like, that is very problematic, but it's fun to watch her do her thing sometimes. Like in the first debate, like I think you got a little sense that, like when she was going after Biden really hard, it was like, oh wow, she must have been a really good prosecutor. Like I can imagine her being very good in that context of making arguments in court. Although it was also funny because like in like the second debate, like she was kind of flat. Like, and I don't know if she was just having a particularly good day the first time, or if she actually made a calculation that, hey, you're probably not going to win, but you might be well positioned to be VP. So like you probably shouldn't go too hard against anybody who might make you one. Yeah. This kind of ties into, I guess, will be kind of the next question that we actually had planned here. What do you think of, my girlfriend and I have been talking about this morning, the fact that the fact that Biden announced the identity, or that it was going to be a black woman beforehand. I mean, what do you think? How do you think that's going to turn out as far as like, I mean, we know that how the right likes to talk about that kind of thing. So what do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think look, I mean, the main thing I think about it is even though as far as this goes, it might work, that Biden has a history of putting his foot in his mouth on racial subjects, including extremely recently. And so, the symbolism of having a black woman on the ticket, like, might help shore up, otherwise, like some otherwise unenthusiastic voters. So it's probably a smart move as far as that goes, but it's also, I'm not saying, everybody, I'm sure lots of people know how to do a Google search to find out what her record was, but some people do respond to that. I mean, like there is a reason that politicians, pay attention to stuff like this. They're not wrong that this is something that, that like that kind of representational politics, does have it, is something that does fire some people up. But I mean, I guess mostly what I think about it is just that it says everything about this moment that we're in, where after So, like after the murder of George Floyd, and there was this like nationwide unrest about police violence, and you'd really think that that would lead to some like really renewed movement for like specific reforms that might do something about police militarization and abuses. And there's been some of that, but mostly, unfortunately, what we've seen, much more than we've seen any of that, has been a lot of fighting about symbolism, right? Like, so just for example, right? Like, look, I'm very much opposed to having, statues of, Confederate supervillains and, town squares, that's, those should absolutely go down. I'm all for that. I was at a like Zoom meeting for DSA members in my little area in the like suburbs of northern Atlanta, and somebody mentioned that there's a street sign in one of those places, Peachtree Corners maybe, that's named after Nathan Bedford Forrest. It's like, all right, that's gross. Fair enough. But it's also really interesting to look at the fact that after so many of like the really bad statues went down, there's this initiative to start going after a bunch of kind of gray area statues. And in some cases, statues that aren't even really gray area, right? Like there was like a famous case where there was an attempt to take down a statue of Abraham Lincoln on the grounds that, he had lots of, he had lots of views that would not be at all progressive, by 2020 standards, right? But on the other hand, if there's actually, in terms of actions, if there's one American president that you really want to valorize, that would be it, right? There should be more statues of Lincoln, honestly. And maybe Sherman, we could put one of those up in Atlanta, but that's a hot take. But that said, it's like really interesting to see that, like, again, okay, all right, we've taken down the really bad statues. Now let's kind of look at the gray area statues, some statues that maybe aren't even gray areas, and what can we get the name of change? What can we, what can we push? My mother has gotten really into bird watching in her retirement, and she told me that there's a move to rename some like kind of obscure warbler that's named after a Confederate general. And it's like, I guess, but like once you get down to the point that you're worried about stuff like that, it kind of seems telling, right? Like, why is it that, right? Not like like, in other words, I'm not going to say symbolism doesn't matter at all. Nobody should care about symbolism, but, whatever. We're a narrative species. We're going to care about symbolism. But this obsession with symbolism that, like, even I remember a week or two ago, time all blurs together in quarantine when I was, they finally restarted NHL. And so, my beloved Red Wings did not make it. They'd already been eliminated. So I was like, all right, I'll watch a Blackhawks game. And it was the, Blackhawks playing the Oilers in Edmonton. And all right, so it's in Edmonton. This is a sport that, like, I think we all know is like 99.999% white. Right. There's lots of diversity in which Eastern European country people come from, but that's about it. And there's like a big Black Lives Matter logo in it, and okay, good, but like also really telling, because what nobody's actually doing anything about is the police militarization and police violence that started the whole thing, or the underlying social conditions, that are behind that, right? Like the main reason that there are racial disparities in police violence is that there are racial disparities in poverty, which obviously goes back to slavery and Jim Crow and FHA redlining and all that stuff. But, this kind of aggressive militarized policing is primarily something that happens in poor neighborhoods. and black people are vastly more likely because of that history of de jure apartheid earlier as American history to live in those neighborhoods. So obviously it's important to curb, the police militarization itself, but like also, the underlying thing, right? I mean, George Floyd was a laid off worker who was choked to death for trying to pass a bad $20 bill. Like the underlying thing behind all of this is about poverty. And so rather than doing anything about police militarization or poverty, we're spending a lot of time worried about, statues and warblers and which corporation can be pressured into making what PR gesture, about how they feel about the movement. And the Kamala Harris pick is just the perfect embodiment of that because, the symbolism is, oh, we're going to have a black woman who's going to be vice president. But of course, the substance is this is somebody who was like a villain on mass incarceration, when she was a prosecutor and attorney general in California.
Yeah, like on the so do you think that like symbolism, obviously like you said, symbolism does matter, but do you think that it sort of creates like a, what's the word I'm looking for, like a cover or a facade? I remember like one of the first nonfiction political books I ever read when I was really young, which probably a good starter book, was Stupid White Men by Michael Moore.
Oh, I read
that. I'm pretty sure it was in that book that I was like introduced to this idea that we've sort of, it's great that saying the N-word, for example, is like considered one of the most taboo things you can do. But the fact that we have made it such a big deal and like it's the most important thing allows us to cover up the systemic issues and to like skate past actually like dealing with like material problems that the black community has.
Yeah, for sure. Right. Like that the more, not obviously that we shouldn't, try to push back against, racial bias, but like also making a big performative deal about that, is a good way of, is a good way of letting yourself off the hook for not doing anything about the underlying conditions. And I think it's important to emphasize that even if like you could like ask a magical genie to eliminate all racial bias from the thoughts of all people tomorrow, as wonderful as that would be, the economic disparities between white people and black people wouldn't go anywhere, right? Because you need actual redistribution to do anything about that. And hence the disparities in police violence would be certainly lowered by eliminating racial bias, but most of it would still be there because it reflects the unequal distribution of poverty. And, it's a point that my friend and editor Doug Lane made when I was talking about this. Even if you sort of go with this thought experiment, the racial bias will be back in 6 months because all societies that have impoverished underclasses end up telling themselves some sort of story, about how, oh, it must be because they're lazy or something like that, right? That like, I think that's kind of a defense mechanism. So you're not too bothered by the disparity. And so, yeah, I think that the stigmatization of any racially or religiously, ethnically, linguistically, demarcated underclass, right? As being, having some, having some sort of stigma, people thinking explicitly or implicitly, that they're somehow inferior. I think that's something you get in all societies, right? Like, I think that the solution, I'm not claiming this is sufficient, right? I'm not making any sort of claim that, that if we had like a nice, like, socialist society where everything was like nationalized or worker co-ops, that like racism would disappear, but I think if you really want to do anything about the level of social problem we have from the current level of stigma, it's not a sufficient solution, but certainly doing something about the economic conditions is a necessary condition for doing anything about that.
Sure. Yeah. Well said. I mean, one of the questions that I think would be kind of fun, if there were like one thing that you could just snap your fingers and do, like one policy to change that you think would maybe make the biggest impact, what would that be? So for me personally, it would be, I mean, there's so many good candidates for that, but I think that like getting money out of politics would take care of a whole lot of other problems. I could change my mind on that, but that's the first one that comes to mind for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would certainly help. I do think that maybe as Americans we're inclined to overstate that because because I think there are other countries where the campaign finance situation is way better, right? Where that, like, they have really short elections, maybe there's even some public funding, that you don't have the kind of uncontrolled spending you have in the United States, where, don't get me wrong, like, the political situation is much better and maybe that does help make it better, but also it's not like that means that that like wealthy business owners don't have massive amounts of political influence. They just, I think it's just exercised in different ways, some of the same ways, some different ways, right? And so I guess I would just say, like, yes, and right, like, yeah, of course we should do that. We should do that for sure, right? But, like, also, I think we should be clear-eyed about the fact that as long as you have concentrated economic power, it's always going to find some way to concentrated political power.
Yeah, I don't know if end capitalism is like an acceptable answer to that question, but
it seems like kind of cheating. I think, I don't know. I mean, I like what it looks like is like a one sentence policy thing. I'm not sure about, but, like, I think maybe, like, winding down the overseas empire, like, I don't know, maybe, like, as something that, like, gestures at what I'm talking about, at least, that could, like, count as an answer for this game. I think, like, abolish the CIA, something like that. Like, I think just, and the reasoning is just that, without going overboard and saying that, like, U.S. imperialism is the only reason for, like, bad political situations in lots of countries in the global South, it's obviously not. But if you look at the history, and I'm not just talking about, like, ancient, like, John Foster Dulles, kind of, 1950s United Fruit Company history, but, like, really, if you look at even the history of, like, the 21st century, as far as the way that even pretty mildly reformist left-wing governments in Latin America especially tend to be very aggressively interfered with by the United States. I think that if we could somehow a la carte do something about that, right? I think that would go a long way as far as the world in general. I mean, like, God, obviously the coup against Hugo Chavez in 2002. There was the attempted Juan Guaido coup against Maduro, like, a year ago. The removal of Zelaya in Honduras. My favorite example is the removal of Aristide in Haiti in 2004. He was literally escorted out of the country by U.S. Marines. And the reason that's my favorite example, and obviously we could throw in the U.S. connections to the framing up of Lula and Brazil and the sort of soft coup against Dilma Rousseff. But the reason Haiti is my favorite example is because, like, it really shows, like, how little tolerance there is for this by the United States. Because when Aristide ran for president of Haiti the first time, his slogan was literally that he was going to raise the Haitian people from misery to poverty, and then, well, there was an initial coup against him. He was restored, to power in the Clinton era. There's a lot of stuff that happened then, and it's like there were many ways that he had to, like, compromise and water down his initial proposals, but, like, the fact that the initial effort was so modest and it was met with what it is really a sign of how little breathing room there is there to do anything about to have any kind of, like, social progress in those countries. I mean, that's part of the reason why, without saying that therefore it's good and we shouldn't criticize it, right? But I mean, I think just as a factual statement, it's part of the reason why Cuba went the route that it did, right? that Castro and Guevara and everybody saw what had happened in Guatemala, where there was this coup and kind of reign of terror against the left-wing government. And they're like, well, I mean, look, we're not going to like let that happen to us, right? So that gave them a reason to to go in a relatively more authoritarian direction. And again, like, without saying anything about that normatively, it's certainly, I think if you're going to be real about the history, right, like that has to go into the bad consequences of U.S. meddling in Latin America column. And, I mean, whatever, like we could keep talking. I mean, I know we just want to do 20 minutes or whatever. We could easily keep talking about this,
Sure.
for hours. And there are first world examples of what I'm talking about too. But, that's why I've often thought that, like, I don't know that we're going to make it to, to socialism in the U.S. before, like, I think just for all sorts of cultural reasons, I think we might have to have socialism everywhere but the U.S., before we have, socialism in the U.S. And so I think that maybe that's too pessimistic. I don't know, but like, it's certainly a thought that, that I've had many times. And if that's the case, right, then what we can at least do, right, is to redistribute, like, we can in the short term push for an aggressively social democratic agenda that can at least force some guns versus butter trade-offs that could lead to a reduction in some of the stuff we're talking about, which would give like a lot of other people in a lot of other countries room to breathe. And then, like, who knows what could, then like further down the line, I mean, we're certainly, let's put it this way, right? Like, we're certainly not going to be at the front of the line or even the middle of the line, like I'd be very, very surprised, if it happened that way. But if we can at least, but if we can at least have a successful push to spend more money on social priorities in the United States and thus less money on foreign meddling, then that would do a lot to at least like get some movement going at the front of the line.
Right. Yeah. The imperialism answer, I think, is a really good one, because it's can be kind of difficult to justify why that's not the main issue to focus on all the time, because it's the one that, causes the most death, arguably the most death and suffering.
Right.
It's the, it's kind of like the U.S. as an entity, our responsibility to the rest of the world, like, as citizens of this country, to at least stop, putting our shit on other countries. And and also I think like the snap your fingers magic wand kind of thing is good for that one, because like that seems, and you seem to suggest there that socialism, or like implementing like a real, something close to socialism at home, would be the most difficult thing. But the U.S. military machine, that one, that's got a lot of momentum, and that seems like it would be a pretty difficult one to dismantle.
Absolutely, right. I mean, which is why, even though we were playing the like magically snap your fingers game, I was still like kind of like, okay, well, how do we actually do that as a political program? And I think that's why it's like, all right, so tie it to like domestic priorities to get people to actually care about it, because
Right.
Because if not, like they're not going to, right? Like that's not, most people, especially now, right? Most people don't have a family member, who serves in the military. It's like gotten down to the point where I think now it's like it's like fairly concentrated, right? It's a fairly, it's a relatively small minority of the population that serves directly. And of course, even when you do, that can lead people to draw anti-war conclusions. Their loved ones aren't sent into harm's way, but obviously it can and usually does have the opposite effect, right? Realistically, in most circumstances, right? Like not under all circumstances, but under lots of, if it's like World War I and like, people have been dying left and right fighting the Germans for years, and the Bolsheviks say that if they come to power, they're gonna make peace with Germany. Then like, sure, under those circumstances, okay, my son can finally come home. We'll give you a reason to support it. But under most circumstances, people want to believe. There's a pretty powerful incentive to believe that that your son or nephew or niece or whatever is fighting in a just cause, and so that doesn't do it even necessarily for people who do have family members in the service, and most people don't. And especially when you start talking about like drone assassinations and stuff like that, right? I mean, like, that's something that we care about a lot, but that's like a very hard sell, right? Like, I spent a lot of time in the Obama years, like haranguing my liberal friends about that stuff. And it's a very, that's like a real uphill battle, to get people to see that as any kind of priority.
Yeah. And on the subject of, I guess, bringing more people in. Well, I was reminded of, when I remember when I was in high school, and we reached the age where people were able to start joining the military. And there were like guys I had been in like punk rock bands with who were joining the military. And I was like, what the hell? Was this just like cosplay or LARPing or something to y'all? Even people who I thought kind of were like, hardcore leftists with me were like, I guess I'll join the military now. And it's like, how could it, change that, hold those two ideas in your head at once? And speaking of just like trying to make the left look appealing and bring more people into the left, Joe Rogan. He's a good sort of fulcrum or anchor, getting normal human persons to come over to the left, or at least like entertain some of the ideas that we have over here. Now, I do think that like to some degree the protests, the BLM protests and stuff have done some work in that direction. I know like my girlfriend's parents who are, they're basically like just, liberals. They have been more receptive to some of our more radical ideas that we will talk with them about since all that started. But you have one of the best, actually the best critique / defense of description of Joe Rogan and the phenomenon of, people loving or hating him. And I was wondering if you could kind of like summarize your feelings on that.
Sure. So, I've listened to a decent amount of Rogan that, partially just, same reason that lots of people do, is he's like a very, he's a very likable presenter, and it's a very, it's a very listenable podcast, right? If I'm going to go, if I'm going to go for a run, I'm not going to listen to, to some podcast I might listen to where people are going to be talking about the labor theory of value, while I'm like, sweaty and can barely think, so it's very good for that. But I think that, I'm sure that there are already going to be people who are listening or watching up to this point, who want to like, yell at the screen or whatever format they're taking this in with, because they're going to say, but Joe Rogan is awful. He had like, he had this or that or the other, like horrible reactionary ghoul on his show, and he nodded along with everything they said. And what about this comment that he made, last year? And what about this thing that he said in this episode? And about which I would say, take a deep breath. I agree with you about all that, right? But I think you're thinking about it wrong. And we can talk in a minute about the reason why I think so many people are thinking about this wrong. But I think that the basic thing about Rogan is that, obviously relative to a very specific, demographic that he comes from and is speaking to, that kind of like stoner jock, whatever you want to say, right? It's
yeah. What is a word? They're not bros per se, but they're in that same sort of ballpark.
Yeah. There's something that a lot of people would call bros, but I think that like says something about the limits of the word, because it's like you can't use it to describe that and also use it to describe, Republican frat boys. That's too expansive, right?
Exactly.
Like Joe Rogan reminds me a lot of dudes I've been friends with over the years, right?
Same here.
And in particular, one of the ways that he reminds me of them is that he's kind of all over the place politically. That like sometimes he has, like bad right-wing impulses and, whatever sort of people who are annoyed that I praised him earlier, right? Whatever like montage of clips you've got going in your head to prove that case. It's like granted, right? But he also has some very left-wing impulses and frequently expressed those. Just some examples that come to mind. There's an amazing clip where he's arguing with Dave Rubin about libertarianism, and like, he doesn't invite people on his show to fight with them almost ever, right? Like, like if somebody's invited on, that means he basically likes you and he just kind of wants to chat, but like there's a point where like what Rogan was saying about how we don't need any of these government, things got dumb enough that Rogan couldn't stand it and he had to like say something about it, right? Like, like Rubin, well, actually very timely right now, because the Trump administration is trying to destroy the Postal Service. Rubin says, oh, what does government do? Right? Nothing. And Rogan's like, well, they do the post office pretty good. And, they get into this whole argument about whether if we abolished or privatized the post office, whether UPS and, Amazon and all that, would be better or, much worse, which is what Rogan was saying for all the right reasons, that like, that they wouldn't have any profit incentive to put, mail centers in like rural areas and, all that stuff. Right. Or like there's a great, much more recent clip, right, from this year of him arguing with Dan Crenshaw about Medicare for all, yeah, no, you should check it out, right? Like it's very good. Or there's a really good one from, I don't know, maybe 2018, 19, where he's talking about the Trump administration's, family separation policy, and he's just ranting about how, if you think it's okay to, to take, like nab children out of their mother's arms, then you're not on Team Human, and he goes off on this whole rant about that. He throws in at the end. He reiterates his support for Medicare for all, right? He supported Bernie Sanders in the primary, and in fact, right, the only like Sanders, Andrew Yang, and Tulsi Gabbard were the only candidates that were on his show. And trust me, it's not because nobody else wanted to be. It's the most popular podcast in the world by some measures, but like those were the only ones he liked enough to talk to, and he ended up, saying, supported Sanders. And when people did what he did, some people were like really mad about this because of, because of cases where he said bad or stupid or reactionary things, which certainly exist. But again, to my mind, that's missing the point in two ways, which first is that if you're actually serious about power, and if you're not, what are we doing? Then what you want is for people who you wouldn't necessarily expect to always line up with you to support you, because you win if you have more people supporting you. That seems pretty straightforward. And then the other thing is, again, I think the more fundamental mistake that people are making, and this goes to, I think, what you're really asking about, is that they assume that everybody in the world has like a well-defined ideological worldview, and really almost nobody does, right? Like that's extremely rare. That, there are obviously, almost nobody is an overstatement. There are lots of people in the world who, who are extremely loyal viewers of Sean Hannity / Rachel Maddow, who have imbibed everything that Sean / Rachel has to say and can,
Right.
can repeat it all on command and, whatever. That certainly exists. But I think that, and that's a decent chunk of the population, but it's not the majority, right? Most people don't think about politics all the time. Right. Like that's probably the most everyman thing about Joe Rogan, that like he doesn't, he's interested in politics. I'll have people on to talk about politics with him, but he's at least as interested in mixed martial arts and psychedelics and half a dozen other subjects,
Right.
as he is in politics. And like most people who aren't like weird political obsessives like us, he doesn't really have, what he has is he has political impulses, he has political reactions to things that happen, but like most people, he hasn't spent enough time thinking about it for those impulses to cohere together into some kind of consistent worldview.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, and so yeah, like lots of times he says stuff I totally agree with, sometimes he says stuff I totally disagree with, but I think that rather than focusing on the stuff that he gets wrong and being mad at him about it, which I think goes to the conversation we were having earlier about symbolism and how like there's this general cultural trend towards more and more people, especially on the left, seeing politics primarily through the prism of this kind of moralistic evaluation of who's a good person, who's a bad person, and which is just massively unhelpful and alienating, to most people. But so they're obsessed with this question of like, is Joe Rogan going to heaven or not? And I think a better question is, how should we relate both to this show and more generally to the Joe Rogans of the world, right? The legions of people who aren't political obsessives, who maybe even like have some bad cultural views that are floating around their heads because, that's how that works, but who also are generally good-hearted people who hear let's tax the rich and give everybody health care and say, oh yeah, no, that's a good idea, bro. We should do that, right? Like, and I think the way we should relate to those people is that we should be extremely nice to them and try to, find ways to speak to them, in terms that they understand. And on the subjects on which he's good, which are actually a lot of subjects, right? Like on many, many, many subjects where he actually has like really good, solid, progressive, social democratic kinds of views. Joe Rogan is actually an extremely good political communicator, because like for example, that Dan Crenshaw interview I mentioned, he doesn't do like, he doesn't do what I would be, tempted to do, which is to like kind of, be a little snarky about it and do and like really like go after Crenshaw and, try to expose like the inconsistencies and stuff, which, whatever, there's definitely a place for that. But instead, right, he has this very like grounded kind of common sense, like, yeah, dude, I don't know, that doesn't really make sense to me. What about, right?
Right.
And it's just, and that's something that's going to be more appealing to more people, right? Like than even what I was describing, never mind what a lot of leftists would do, which is that they would just like yell at him about how he was a horrible person for thinking that,
right?
Which has, maybe gets a go off king sort of reaction from people who already agree with you, but that's all it does.
Yeah, no, I actually just yesterday sent, his recent thing with Ben Shapiro. I commented somebody on, somebody I knew from Facebook who's, good dude. He posted something about, people of color having a victim mentality. And that's what's responsible for their, material conditions. And so I just posted in response that clip of Rogan talking to Ben Shapiro where they were discussing that very thing about like, how the historical precedent is what causes those conditions. And I think that was probably the most effective tool I could have possibly had in that moment.
Oh, totally. Yeah. Because Rogan, is not by any means a dumb guy, but he is like, but he's not somebody who is going to go at that, from a perspective that like assumes a bunch of shit that most people, who are hearing it, like don't necessarily know about or aren't necessarily on board with,
Right.
Like it's going to be, it's he's somebody who's going to like relate on a level that's going to make sense to even a lot of people who might otherwise not along with Shapiro, and say, and it's just, he's so obviously going to be coming from a place of, I actually care about this underlying thing because like I care about helping people, and I think you're really like making a mistake about this, and I'm going to explain why, rather than from a place of you're my enemy and I'm going to score some points.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Important to remind people, and Joe Rogan is really good at that, leftism is the reason that we want equality is because we care about people and have compassion and empathy for them. And I think most people feel the same way. They just, maybe we don't put that on Front Street as much as we should.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Like, I think there are a lot of ways that, even though the underlying impulse is that, that you want like a fairer, more decent, more equal society. I mean, if you didn't, why would you bother with any of this? But like, just because of some of the way that the culture war works and, lots of other stuff, we often have a tendency to translate that into, I'm going to like, I'm going to try to prove something by like really showing like what a piece of shit this guy I'm talking to is, which is, is something that like, I'm not even saying like, don't ever talk that way. I'm sure anybody who wants to accuse me of hypocrisy on this point can also assemble a montage of clips to prove that, right? But the point is not like, I'm better than you, do exactly what I do. The point is that like it's something for all of us, first person, to think about, right? That like if we seem to be coming from a place of moral condemnation of individuals, most people are going to have a very bad reaction to that. Or if we seem to be coming from a place of like, I'm going to win one for my team, right? Like I think most people can pick up on that. Whereas if we front load the actual thing that we do all care about underneath it all, right? And like we really find ways to like express that clearly, that like, no, I'm coming from a place of, I want to, I want to create a society where people would be better off than they are right now. I want to do something, about the actual social problem itself. And so maybe because you don't see the need of that, I'm going to try to like, I'm going to try to express it in a way that you or the people in your audience, maybe, who can come around, like what will make sense to them. The more that we can communicate that way, right, the better off we'll be, right? Like, so, well, actually, like one last Rogan example, like the, I think like one of my favorite Rogan episodes was the one he did last year with Cornel West.
Oh, that was great.
And, and it's great, because like you can also see, like West is, like, yeah, I mean, Rogan's already like very amenable to some things and whatever, but like, but it's like obviously Cornel West, does have a very like coherent, well-defined worldview. And, and it's certainly, he's certainly to Rogan's left. And you could tell as you listen to that conversation that like, and whatever, even relative to the fact that Rogan does have a certain tendency to like nod along with guests, right? Like that's part of what makes him so likable, that, that like, he tends to yes and everything. But you could also tell, like, if you listen to a lot of Rogan interviews, that like West is somebody who like really impressed him and like really like, like this is something that like, and he was like, and he was having a lot of impact on him. And I think that makes sense because West is somebody who is very good at speaking from, from that place, right? That like, I think, like the worst thing that like, I mean, the worst thing Cornel West is ever going to say about an individual is like, I remember when he was interviewed on the Michael Brooks show, he was like, yeah, these right-wing brothers, God bless them, they don't have good arguments. Like that's like about as harsh as it's going to get from West when he's talking about, evaluation of individuals as opposed to the ideas themselves or, systems of domination.
Cornel West is, by the way, dream guest, dream just person to meet. He is just, have you ever met him by chance?
I have not, no. Yeah, but I agreed, right? Like that was actually I was really happy that Michael did, before before he passed, like because that was not that long before then.
Right.
That he had, he was going to some event at Yale, I want to say, I don't know, one of those places, right? And he got to speak, on a panel with West, and West then came on the show afterwards, and I know that was huge for him. I think that, and like I think in terms of like, getting to like meet people in person who meant something a lot to him, I think like that and like the Lula interview were probably the two big ones for him.
Right. Yeah. So I'm mindful of your time. So I'll kind of cut off what I was going to say there and move on to the last question. I guess this ties in really well. So, Cornel West is sort of an artist in his own way. There's certainly a beauty to the way that he, orates.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, that was, I guess that's kind of the most important thing. Cause I am an artist, like I'm a teacher and, like I've been English and ESL teacher and stuff like that. But, primarily my main thing has always been, playing music, writing stories and poetry and stuff. So, so I think I'd like to think that art can be a powerful leg of of any political movement, but especially the leftist movement, because it is so much about leftist ideas have been shoved aside for so long that I think it requires a lot of imagination and obviously empathy. And these are things that art is supposed to help cultivate. But yeah, what kind of role would you see art playing in the movement?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I guess the two things that I think there is that there is obviously a role for like directly and explicitly political art. Just whatever, like obvious stuff that comes to mind, are all the Irish songs about like resisting British imperialism that like are obviously, very important to the Irish Republican movement. Historically that music has meant a lot there, and whatever. Like as somebody with relatively little connection to it, right? Like I enjoy drinking whiskey and listening to that stuff, but or in a more grounded way, right? Like, or a more I guess I should say close to home way, right? I mean, like I think it's undeniable that to go back to one of the very first things we talked about in the first half of the interview, that punk, like if nothing else, like helped a lot of people like mentally survive the Reagan years, and that's not nothing, like that's a service.
Right.
So I think there definitely is a role for that, and certainly again, there's a reason that things like the Irish Republican movement or the early American labor movement, that there was so much like inspirational music that went with that. And there's definitely a role, a role for that. And if you, for comedians certainly who are going to talk like Dave Chappelle, right? Like the thing that he put out after the George Floyd protest started, it was just like a mini special. It was called 846.
Yeah, excellent.
Yeah, that was really good. It was like really compelling, like I'm glad, like, yeah, I thought that was like a really good, really compelling thing, so there's definitely a role for that. But I guess it's a little bit like, well, okay, so the two things I was going to say were, one, I mean, I would also be very sad to live in a world where like artists felt like they had to be making like super political stuff all the time to like do their part or whatever, because like part of what we like, look, not everything has to serve the cause, because then what's the cause, right? Like the cause is having a world where people are living under better conditions and they're better able to enjoy everything that's good about life. And art, I think, to me mostly falls, like it's like philosophy for that matter, right? Like I think the kind of like certainly analytic philosophy tradition I come out of, some of that, like the G.A. Cohen analytic Marxist stuff, like is politically useful. Lots of it isn't. And that's perfectly okay, right? Like I think like getting to think hard about basic questions about knowledge and reality is like a valuable human activity. And I want a society where more people have more time to think about stuff like that. And similarly, I want people to have more, time and energy to create, and consume art, like the Joe Rogan Cornel West interview that I was talking about. Like part of the like really special talent that West has is that he's able to bring this kind of intensity to making just about anything that he's talking about really compelling. Like after I listened to that interview, I started reading some Anton Chekhov short stories I'd never read before, because like there's a point early in the interview when Wes starts talking about Chekhov to Rogan, and he's so intense about it. It was like really, it's like, have you read the stories of Anton Chekhov? You haven't lived until you've read Anton Chekhov. And I was like, wow, all right, I'm gonna check some of that out, But so I think that and I think that that's an important thing to front load here, because because I think it's a real mistake in a couple of directions. Like I think the same way that I think the right attitude that you should take to Rogan is like, roll your eyes when he says something dumb, but don't make too big a deal about it, right? And like and like when he says something that's like useful, like the clip you're talking about, like shout it from the rooftops. Like I think that's the smartest play there. I think similarly, when somebody does make a piece of art that's politically useful, great, fantastic, right? Like, like play it at all your rallies, right? That's, but also don't start primarily judging art by its political usefulness, because I think that gets really dumb in a couple of different directions. One of it is that it can, it could just lead to being like a Stalinist weirdo about it,
Right.
and two, the flip side of that's more often a problem in contemporary American culture is that we get our wires crossed a little bit about what the primary role of these things is, in a way that leads to like valorizing these things in a way that doesn't necessarily make sense, right? Like something I think about a lot of this connection is back in 2008, 10, wherever that was, right? When 12, I don't know. One of those times was a long time ago,
right?
When Jon Stewart did that rally to restore sanity in Washington, D.C.
Oh, yeah.
And the thing itself I found very annoying for all kinds of probably predictable lefty reasons, but like also like, I think there's a lot of false equivalency going on there and, whatever, but like, but also like more importantly, why is anybody traveling to Washington, D.C. to like go to a political march because a comedian told them to, right? Like there's something very weird about that.
Yeah, it's the getting like actual information from like music or comedians is maybe not the best idea. That was, like the last episode where I did some recommendations for lefty stuff. I talked about one of my favorite bands, Propagandhi, and I think that really they became a better band when their songwriting sort of matured out of writing, I think as their singer put it, I used to write songs about the COINTELPRO papers, and like I would, just be very specific. And, they evolved into, I think, a much better artists when they're still extraordinarily political, like almost 100% of their songs are, but they, it's a lot more poetic now, I guess. And, connections to personal things and, can be applied to more than just the specific issue that, the song is about.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, to come up with to use a contemporary example, David Rovix, who I assume is still working, right? It's been a long time since I saw any of his music. But, but he has, but I think he's somebody who's very hit and miss, and sometimes is really good, sometimes not, and like, so like I'll just, not to be too much of a hater about this, my only example will be one of the ones I think is good, which is, he's got this great song called St. Patrick's Battalion, St. Patrick's Brigade, one of those, which is like this like old timey folk song that he wrote, I think, right? He certainly performed. I think he wrote it by, I want to say St. Patrick's Brigade, about these Irish immigrants during the Mexican War who, like basically right off the boat, right, were like sent into the army, and then they kind of realized that, oh, hey, we're on the wrong side here, that like the U.S. is acting in Mexico just like, the British acted in Ireland, and they like mass defected into the Mexican army. Like this is like a very like obscure historical incident, but it's like this awesome song about that. I love that. Right. But then like, he also made a lot of songs, at least during the Bush years, maybe he's gotten better about this, that like kind of felt like he was trying to wedge a op-ed column into song lyrics.
That's one of the big, I think, people's big complaints about political music in general. It's kind of hard to sell people on political music because that's what they're expecting a lot of times.
Yeah, exactly. Like there's a reason why, well, look, probably, I mean, the fact this my go-to probably says something about all of the, how much of my musical tastes are like revolve around like goofy, overplayed boomer music I like, but like something like, Black Sabbath's War Pigs, is like something that like you can still like, it still has resonance. You can listen to it now and it still has resonance. Whereas like about 1,000 songs that were made about the Iraq War are just like embarrassing to listen to now, right? Like not, like I think like the only person who really comes to mind, like most of it sounds like, the Green Day album at best, and
American Idiot.
Yeah, and the at worst gets a lot worse, right? Like the only really good song that I can think of off the top of my head about the Iraq War is Tom Waits' Hell Broke Loose. And the reason for that, there's a reason for that, right? Which is that the song tells a story about this, like it's just this, like the song is the story of this soldier who, came back from the war with like, hearing problems and PTSD and, like, and it's this like, but it's like this intensely felt personal story, which is actually like a good format for a song. Whereas like so much of the Bush era stuff, it's like, instead of doing like, War Pigs or any number of, it's that classic song, like the, early, this, like the old about World War I, Christmas in the Trenches, things like this that like have this staying power because they're about like things that are going to have resonance with people as long as like war is something that happens and we think about. Whereas so much of the Bush era stuff is like really an attempt to kind of like litigate the partisan narratives of the moment, which means that it's like not very good even when it comes out, and like 10 years later it's completely dated.
Yes, yeah. I just realized I'm wearing an Anti-Flag shirt, and that I would say the same thing for Anti-Flag, that they're at their best when they're, speaking about more about broader issues. Although they do have a song, I think, from their '99 album, "A New Kind of Army," that is about two specific police brutality stories, but it is just as sadly just as relevant today as it was then. But
yeah, no, and I also think that like I think that's probably going to be okay, because I think that if you have like I think you could like write a song about, I don't know, Rodney King that would still have resonance now, or you could write a song about George Floyd that would still unfortunately probably have resonance in 20 years, and because whatever, not that like people only care, not that like people only respond emotionally to music that's that's about something that's still an ongoing issue, but that does unfortunately help, but I think because the reason that you could, though, is if what you're narrating is like this specific horrible thing that happened to a specific human being, that's going to have emotional resonance that it's not going to have if you're like, I don't know, like, I don't know what the police brutality equivalent would be of this, right? But it's like, but it's like the Bush Iraq equivalent would be like you're writing a song about Scooter Libby or something.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that would like it's I guess it is a fine line between like, if you like you can speak about specifics. I mean, one of my favorite Bad Religion songs is about the Kyoto Protocol, but it's called Kyoto Now, and it just like
right.
And I mean, I think that song like is it illustrates its point in a way that you can sort of apply it to many different situations and many different like similar sort of things that we're issues we're dragging our feet on. Where the cringe really comes in is when it's something like you said, the like talking about Scooter Libby, or somebody's name that nobody's going to remember in 20 years.
Exactly. Like I think that if you either do like, well, actually, those two songs I just mentioned, I think are good illustrations, right? Like if you either do the War Pigs route of just having lyrics about like death and destruction and politicians sending poor people to die that like could equally well be written about the Iraq War or World War I or whatever, some story that's specific enough that it doesn't feel like you're trying to make a political argument in a song lyric. It feels like you're telling a story about a human being. I think
exactly. Yeah. That's what I was just kind of like searching for there. Yeah. The human connection, if you can make that. Yeah. And that, I mean, I think that really speaks well to what, and that was like more than I was hoping for with your answer to that. Cause like, that's, I think speaks well to what makes how politics can inform art to make the art good. As opposed to like, is art useful as a political tool, which, just from personal experience, like I told you, I think the first half of the interview that, that's what got me into politics in the first place was, the bands that I loved were leftists and, anti-war mostly. Do you have any experience with like, a piece of art that?
Yeah. I mean, look, I think there probably are, okay, like Jonathan Franzen's novel Freedom is like a book that I like a lot, but there's some stuff that's like very much like Bush era politics at the moment in it, with that like I think I read as this is fine. It's like a little too obvious, but he's like, it's like it's a little bit too obvious. Like you could hear him a little bit too much being like, when he wrote those like scenes being like, see motherfuckers, do you see now? Right. It doesn't really work that well. Right. Whereas something like there's a William Gibson novel. It's like not one of the classic cyberpunk ones, but it's like one of these like here and now ones that he wrote like within the last like 15 years.
I know as like leftist novels go, or at least like critiques of capitalism, a big one for me was The Dispossessed, Ursula Le
Oh,
Guin.
Ursula, yeah.
Love that one.
Oh, pattern recognition. That's what it was called. And I mean, I don't, and that's a nice. So I don't know if you would think of that as an anti-capitalist novel or not. Like, you could certainly read it that way, right? Because there's a lot of stuff I think that's very inspired in there by like that Naomi Klein book about brands, and but like the thing that like sticks in my mind for that isn't even so much like the main stuff that the novel is about, but like some of the details and like the scenes that are set in Russia about like the extreme like post-Soviet like economic inequality and social breakdown. It's like not something any character is talking about, but just like the way it's like kind of illustrated in those scenes. Like, I think probably, God, I mean, I probably read that book like 15 years ago, right? But it's like that one, like that one definitely like lingers in my head in ways that like some of the things that are much more obviously like, hey, I'm gonna like have a character who's gonna like, like do the like slimy Republican talking points. You're gonna see how bad they are. Really doesn't.
Isn't I've never read an Ayn Rand novel, but I think there is like one of them where the main character gives like a speech that's like 50 pages long or something like that.
Yeah. Atlas Shrugged. I think that's the Galt speech at the end. But
Okay.
yeah, right. Like, and it's so like in so many ways those books are like are just the exact like, I don't know. It's kind of funny. It's like she left the Soviet Union, and it's like, all right, well. I disagree with all the political substance, but like, I really want to write like a, like the format of like a socialist realist novel that like would make my censors proud, like, I just want to rewrite the pro-capitalist version of that.
Interesting. Yeah. I've, haven't thought of it that way, but, yeah, she definitely has the, whenever they like get somebody from who used to live in Venezuela to speak on Fox News or whatever, just a great mouthpiece for the anti-socialist or anti-left viewpoint, right? She was kind of the OG on that.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, like I said before, thank you so much for being so generous with your time. Like, is there anything else you want to add on anything that we've talked about here today, or maybe put a pin in some of the, last stuff we were talking about, maybe come back to it a little later?
Yeah, let's do that for sure.
Okay, awesome. Now, where can people find you, Mr. Ben Burgis? Twitter and all that stuff?
At Ben Burgis on Twitter, so it's Burgis. You mentioned Dead Pundit Society earlier. I think that's at Dead Pundits on Twitter or whatever. Just like go into your podcast feed and look up Dead Pundit Society.
Definitely check that out.
And there actually is also just very, very recently, there's a new, there's a solo podcast. So Dead Pundit Society, I co-host with Adam Proctor and Brianna Last. But I also just started a solo show called Give Them an Argument, right? Same name as the book. So episode 1 at least as we're recording this conversation, just hit iTunes like yesterday. And talked to Matt Leck and Harvey J.K. and Bhaskar Sankara and Liza Featherstone on that one. But tried to keep those relatively short. It's a much shorter episode than that lineup probably makes it sound like. And then coming up for the next one, talking to David Griscom from the Michael Brooks Show, Lee Phillips, who's the co-author of a really good book on socialist economics called People's Republic of Walmart, and Anna Kasparian from the Young Turks, and also just to prove that this show is not going to purely be an exercise in me talking to people I agree with, Dave Smith, who's a libertarian podcaster and comedian I've debated in the past, is also going to come on that second episode, so very excited about that. Check that out. Either again, you can do that on any of the places you normally get podcasts, or you can watch it on YouTube, the video version, or to get early access, go over to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. And read me in Jacobin just about every week, and that is the stuff that comes to mind.
Awesome. Have not gotten around to listening to that new podcast yet, but I'm real excited to. I'm always excited when Matt Leck shows up on anything. He is hilarious and very, very intelligent. Have you heard Literary Hangover? His podcast.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, great for us literary nerds, and marries that with some leftism too. So it's beautiful. Hopefully we'll be speaking with you again soon. But I'll shoot you a message, and I'll like tag you on Twitter when this episode goes up. And cool if we put it up on YouTube and the podcast feed.
Sounds good.
All right, awesome. Have a wonderful day, Ben Burgis. Thank you, sir.
All right, thanks, Kevin.
And that's going to do it for Breadsheet today. Thank you so much to my guest, Ben Burgis. I feel very smart and useful for putting your brain thoughts into the world. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Hoss_Bossman. Check out my YouTube channel, Hoss Bossman, and Ben Burgis at Ben Burgis. That's Burgis on Twitter, not Burgess. Dead Pundit Society. Give Them an Argument, 2 podcasts. And Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left is his book. It is fantastic. Highly recommend you read it. It's like short and a very fun read, very well written. Check that out. Check his podcasts out. Follow him on Twitter to see when he writes stuff up in Jacobin and whatnot. We are writing out today on a song my friend Jake requested, who he was very close with Trent as well. Trent, my good friend who passed, was a great musician, but he didn't sing, really do like a singer-songwriter-y kind of thing. So what mostly survives him in that realm are lead guitar parts he did on other people's songs, and also some instrumental stuff that he did. The instrumental transitional music or bumper music I played before was Trent's, and this is an old song that Jake actually wrote and Trent played lead guitar on. It's Garth Rivers singing lead, and there's other people. Anyway, this is about Trent. I love you, Trent. Everybody, please contribute to Nucci Space. That's nucci.org, nuci.org. Give them $1, give them $5, give them $100. They do great work. And I think that's going to about do it. For all the other stuff, just, look at the episode description. I always paste links to all my social media and try to put relevant videos and articles and stuff like that in the show notes. If I left anything out, let me know. I love you guys. I'll be back with another mini-sode with Hoss Recommends and all that good stuff very soon. Please be good to each other. Be kind to each other. Talk to your friends who you haven't spoke to in a while. And make sure that your friends know that you love them. And make sure that you radiate positive love, healing, light, energy from your soul as you go about life in this crazy, mixed up, weird, beautiful, and ugly universe of ours. Love you all. Bye. It's a Breadsheet.